We're going to get started with introducing our next speaker. Again, we want to say thank you to all of our sponsors, and make sure you visit their booths right outside this room, and make sure you get your breakfast in the room next door. So let's get started with our next speaker. I want to introduce Loren Dealy Mahler. She leverages experience across national security, corporate communications, and crisis management, and helps her clients grow their business through smarter communication strategies while protecting themselves through improved organizational resilience and incident response management. So put your hands together for Loren Dealy Mahler. Thank you.
All right, good morning. Good morning. I have to say a big giant thank you for anyone who would get up and be out here this early on a Saturday. And I know we've all been out here for a while already, so here we go. Round two, we'll load up on coffee again after this, or at least I will. I don't know about the rest of you. I have a 4-year-old, so I've been going for quite some time already. So to give you a quick sense, this is not going to be the same as the other presentations you're going to hear today. This is not technical. This is not anything IT. This is not systems and networks. This is how do we make your jobs more secure and better? And how are executives in this space now, how are CISOs, how are CIOs, how are people who want to move up the food chain in this space thinking, and what are they taking into account so that they can be better at their jobs this day? So we're talking about incident response, communications specifically. Incident response, obviously a big piece, but we're talking about the one element that is quite often the most overlooked, and that's when something happens, how do you communicate so that you don't make everything worse? I like to say, how do you avoid actually pouring gasoline on yourself when someone else is already lighting a match and throwing it at you? So this is where we're gonna start. A quick little background on why I'm in this space and why I do this. And as Roman was saying, I come from a background in national security. I spent a decade in DC, Department of Defense, NSC, Capitol Hill, all over the place, and then did corporate communications in New York and missed the security. I found the corporate space to be incredibly boring, but really, really enjoy helping companies, organizations protect themselves and defend themselves. So I went out on my own and I get to overlap all those fun things. But from all those different perspectives, have realized this is quite often a blind spot that harms organizations. So whether you are in-house in a security team or in an IT role, or you are with a company, a vendor who's providing these services, being more familiar and more aware of this full sort of 360 view of security for a business actually will make you better. So a little bit on the why this all matters. And this right here kind of sums it up. When you read about data breaches, when you read about any type of cyber incident that happens, the reason you're reading about it is because it sucks. Nobody reads about the little things. Nobody reads about the little bump that happened that's a typical Tuesday afternoon glitch in the system. You read about the things that get to the level that's worth reading about. And the really big things that you read about over and over and over and over again, you read about because somebody screwed up the response. You don't read about it once, you read about it 30 times, 40 times. You read about it, we're still reading about updates on Yahoo and Equifax and things like that because they screwed it up. So this right here, this little dumpster fire picture has been a permanent fixture in my Twitter feed from everybody and their mother who uses it to describe every new thing that happens because everything is basically a dumpster fire. You can throw a match at a dumpster and it's not gonna catch on fire, but if you pour gasoline on it yourself, then you're gonna get a big old dumpster fire. So that's what we're gonna work on. And this right here sums it all up. Smart communications from the beginning, when you're doing a good incident response plan, can actually improve organizational resiliency to make your company better capable of weathering a storm. And you can also just avoid making everything more painful. Avoid making everything worse along the way. And at the end of the day, the job you save may be your own. So we're gonna start with some fun facts. Communications, it's not just for the PR team anymore. Going back to some of what Dr. Scholl was just saying, the idea of cybersecurity is a really fun word that everyone outside of our sphere and this bubble here doesn't always understand. Like you were saying, they want to spend all this money on products and all these like magic boxes that we pull off a shelf and we plug in and everybody's happy. Well, it doesn't work that way. But you know what? The reality is everybody who doesn't understand it wants to talk about it, and they usually have the money to spend on it. So you have to help them understand what they should be spending their money on and help them understand the smart way to invest those resources so that they create an actually secure organization, or as we'll see, not just secure, but resilient. So communications, you have to do it, you have to embrace it, whether you like it or not. Not all communications are created equal. There's the kind of communications that you need internally to convince somebody that you need the budgets, that you need the resources, that they don't just need to buy $1 million box off the shelf, but maybe if they spent some on some training or some people, that it might actually have a better impact. There's also the communications that we're going to talk about today that we're going to focus on, which is specifically incident response, specifically crisis communications, but in a cyber setting. So there's a difference there between the communications that your PR team will do that promote your company, promote your organization, that are marketing, internal, where you're actually trying to build out your space and get the things you need in your organization. And then there's the crisis piece, which again, everything we're talking about today. The reason it matters, and the reason that the traditional PR, crisis, response, communications world isn't ready for a cyber event is because a cyber event's not the same. Traditional corporate crisis, you have a product malfunction, you have a CEO scandal, you have, fraud, whatever those things are, they're not going to act the same as a cyber event. And because they don't act the same, the people that you typically say, that team handles this, I don't have to think about it, isn't going to be handling it the right way. They're not going to be handling it in a way that is adequate to the type of an event that you are dealing with in the cyberspace. It won't play out the same way. A cyber event, it can, depending on the size and scope, can take days, weeks, months before you actually know what's happening as you're learning more information over time, whereas a typical traditional corporate crisis happens quickly. And you push information out and you're done, you wash your hands, you move on. That doesn't work in your situation. And if somebody on the communications team is trying to use that old playbook, you're the ones who are gonna pay the price because they're gonna bungle the response. And that blows back on you. So, hey, look at those numbers that are not actually numbers anymore. Sorry about that. So, technically this is number 4, but you can make it number 1 if you want. That's fine, they're all important. So it's really important to remember, whether it's number 1 or number 4, that everything isn't a crisis. We say crisis communications because that's the industry term. That's what we use in the communications world. It's a crisis. Everything's a crisis. Is it a little crisis or is it a big crisis? But it's important to remember that you don't respond to them all the same way. Sometimes a molehill is really just a molehill. You can make it a mountain by screwing it up and by acting the wrong way and responding to it the wrong way, but you don't have to. Sometimes it really is a mountain and you need to treat it like a mountain. You can't just ignore it and pretend it's a molehill, because that's when, you start pouring the gasoline. So it's important to remember that there's different sizes, shapes, scopes of a crisis event. Hey, number 2, that's nice. So I swear to God, these all said 5, 1 through 5, when I finished this the first time around. Again, why it's important to you is because at the end of the day, no matter who is responsible for that communications piece, if it goes wrong, the whole response goes wrong. The slide we just saw, all of those big headlines, all of those individual dumpster fires were based on poorly managed responses that were quite often poor because they were communicated poorly. You know who didn't get fired? The chief marketing officer, the head of communications, the chief PR team lead, whoever that is. The person who gets fired is you. There's always going to be a scapegoat, and it's very rarely the person who communicates badly. So it's important for you to know the way that this should be done, even if you're not the one responsible for doing it, because you are responsible for putting together the security that responds, for putting together the plan that responds to all of this. So at the end of the day, it is technically going to fall back on you, so you need to be able to ask the right questions. So, resilience. We said before, everybody knows this. Every time I feel silly for saying this because it's so obvious, there's always somebody who goes, oh, so I'm gonna keep saying it. We're not looking at defense, we're looking at resilience. We're not looking at, are you secure? We're looking at, are you resilient? You can build up big walls, you can build up all the defenses you want. Someone's getting in them. It's not if, it's when, blah, blah, blah. Again, there's always somebody who looks surprised when they hear that. If you are that person, please don't nod your head and out yourself. So again, it's not about being secure, it's about being resilient. It's not about preventing something forever and ever and ever. It's about making sure that whatever comes at you, you got it. You've got this. Your organization can handle this and move on. It's not just enough to have a resilient network. You have to have a resilient company. You have to have a resilient organization. You have to emerge from this event not only with a clean system, but with a business that is still intact and functioning. And that means you still have customers that want to give you money for something because they still trust you. You still have vendors that want to work with you. You still have that whole client ecosystem that is willing to let you be a part of it. All of those things matter, and they all go back to protecting your reputation, protecting the trust that that is built on. Does that make sense? You can have a really great clean system, and that's awesome because you got, your networks were super resilient, but if no one trusts you enough to use them, it's not a business, it's a hobby. Hobbies don't make you a lot of money unless they're like, Etsy hobbies. Which there's probably not a lot of in this room, let's be honest. So reputation, why does this really matter? Brand reputation, we're gonna be on this slide for like 5 seconds, because again, there is very little about reputation that's actually relevant directly to your day-to-day work. But again, this is part of understanding the big picture of what everyone else is focused on so that you can be better at your jobs. You have more awareness. Brand reputation is what drives your company's bottom line. It's what makes people give you money for something. Products, services, advice, whatever it is, people pay you for something, and you want them to keep doing that. So you have to have a reputation that says, yeah, I'm worth your time and your money. Reputations are absolutely built on trust. You have to protect that trust at all costs. That has to be one of the top things that is a priority, regardless of where you are in your company's system. Where are you vulnerable? This is an important question to look at when it comes to reputation. We talked a lot, and Dr. Scholl was just talking about threat modeling, risk assessments. Good cyber security programs are based on risk. If they're not based on risk, you're probably just buying boxes off the shelf and stacking them on top of each other and hoping you built a really strong wall out of them. That's like Legos. It's not the same. Because trust me, Legos fall apart real fast and suck when you step on them. So when you look at risks, you have to look at where you're vulnerable. What kinds of data are you protecting? People always say, what are your crown jewels? I think there's more to it than that. That's kind of overly simplistic. But when you look at the most obvious kinds of valuable data that you have, people immediately jump to the kinds of things that you see in headlines. Do we have social security numbers? Maybe not. Maybe we do. We should probably protect those. Do we have credit card numbers? Are we a retailer? Do we have customer personal data? Do we have health information? Do we have IP? Are we a company that has the schematics to some weapon system? Or do we have the secret sauce formula to, whatever new thing is out there? Those are the obvious answers. Those are the obvious things that you protect from a business priority perspective. From a reputational perspective, there's more to it. And there's 4 things that I like to touch on that I think are important that are always overlooked. 1, you may have all kinds of things internal to your systems that you haven't thought about. You may have strategy documents. You may have information about plans that your company is looking at. Are you going to be going through an acquisition? Are you exploring different options? Are you looking at being acquired? Are you looking at acquiring someone else? What kind of research have you already done? That's on your system and should be protected. What kinds of market research have you done? Have you done research on competitors in your space? Because that kind of information will be valuable to someone else and will be a little embarrassing if it gets out there to see what you really think about all your competitors. The 2 that are the most often overlooked. Think about every single email that you have sent in the last week. Maybe the last month, but I'm pretty sure the last week will be sufficient for my point. Now imagine that every single one of those emails gets published tomorrow. No context, No opportunity for you to say, oh no, that's not really what I meant. No, that's not really what I think about that person. That has a reputational impact. Think about Sony, the Sony hack. It was just all their emails. How many people were super embarrassed after that came out? How much of an impact did that have on the business when you actually saw what they were talking about and thinking and decisions they were making internally? That can have a huge impact, both personally and professionally. The last one that really is often the moment, particularly if you are a vendor, if you are a small company, if you are a professional services firm, a law firm, a PR company, a consulting company, a business manager, a bank, anything like that, you are part of someone else's network. You have connections to your clients, you have connections to your customers. You may not be interesting, but you have access to interesting people. The most valuable thing that you may offer someone else is access to a bigger fish. And the last thing that you want to do if you're worried about protecting trust and having people trust you as a vendor who offers a similar service to 10 other companies, although obviously superior, but they trust you because they pick you. One of the best ways to reach that trust and to harm that relationship and to convince someone they should go use the other guy is to let a bad actor into their system through your door. You never want to be the weak link in the ecosystem, and it's all an ecosystem these days. There's very little one-off here and there. It's all an ecosystem. You hear everything about third-party breaches. The most obvious is Target. Who would have thought there was anything interesting in an HVAC vendor system? Turns out there wasn't, except there was a door into Target, which was pretty interesting. So just remember that access is something that has to be protected. So there's a lot more that goes into risk assessments and identifying vulnerabilities than just how many users do I have? How many endpoints are there? Like, you have to think about this from the full business perspective. So what can you do? This is reputational resilience, and there's really 3 parts here. And again, these are important for you to understand, even if they aren't directly in your area of responsibility. These may not directly be your AOR, but there is somebody who should be asking these questions and doing these things. And because you are going to be ultimately responsible for how well they do them, you need to be able to ask the right questions. You need to know what they should be doing so you can make sure you're protected by them doing it right. So plan, train, respond. Pretty basic in the incident response space. Obviously, you plan. If you don't train to it, your planning doesn't count. And you have to actually respond. You can have a really cool plan on the shelf, but if you throw it out the window, who cares? You have to actually execute that plan appropriately. So we're going to talk a little bit here. This is where we're going to spend a little bit more of your time, and I have no sense of timing where we are, I guess. Okay, so this right here I think is one of the more important places to spend a little time. So there are 3 pieces to putting together a good plan. A good plan that takes into account reputation, that takes into account the priorities of the other parts of your organization, and it starts with having the right team. Who needs to be in the room? Who, besides just your small data security focused team, needs to be a part of the decisions that are made about how your organization's going to respond? You need to know these people ahead of time. You need to know who they are, how to reach them on a backup plan, because if all of your communication system is compromised, you can't pick up the phone and call somebody, how are they going to know they need to show up? So when you think about across an organization, who needs to be a part of this team? Obviously, you've got IT. You've got your CIO, you've got your CISO. You need to have, obviously, communications, obviously, because somewhere you're going to have to talk to somebody about something, and you need to do that in the right way. So you need a communications rep. You need legal, because as we know, there's about 150 million different overlapping regulations and compliance requirements, and every contract you sign may or may not have some variation of a notification clause in it, and you need to make sure you are moving through that maze the right way. You need to make sure that you are checking all those necessary legal boxes, and I'm not going to go on and on about how important your lawyer is, but they're super important. So you need your lawyer. You need HR, quite honestly. because you need to be able to communicate internally. You need to be able to communicate internally among the employees at your organization, whether there's 5 of you or 5,000. Somewhere, information has to be exchanged so that everyone's aware of what's going on to the extent that they need to be. And anytime you're communicating like that internally to employees, to staff, HR needs to be involved, because that's really in their world. Whether or not they're actually going to compose any of that or hit send on any of those communications, totally irrelevant. They need to be a part of that conversation. So you're probably going to have, depending on your organization, how you're structured, different business units, someone in charge of different regions, different audiences, different customer base. You need to think about who those people are going to be ahead of time. And you need to know who they are. And you need to have updated information so that if some guy switched into a new job or left your company and went somewhere else, because Lord knows there's enough transition around this industry, you need to know who that person is now. God forbid something break, you need someone at midnight and you realize they don't work for your company anymore. And then you have to spend the entire next day figuring out who works there now. Not helpful. So you need your team, and you need to know roles and responsibilities. And you need to have this ironed out ahead of time. I know that sounds silly, because obviously when you all get in the same room, everybody knows what legal does. Everyone knows what PR does. But when it comes to an actual crisis event, an event that is significant enough that it requires all these people in the room together, you are going to have streamlined processes. You're not going to go through the same 12 people have to sign off on every sentence before we say it to anybody, because that's just going to tank you from the start. You have to know what that approval chain is going to look like. You have to know who's going to be in charge of getting information, who's going to be in charge of vetting information, who's going to be in charge of taking that information and writing it in English so that someone else can understand it. All of those things have to be ironed out ahead of time. And one of the big reasons is that you're going to build tools. This is something ahead of time that saves so much time. Because when something occurs, and you all know this, when there's an event, all the rules, we play nice together as a team, everything's nice and orderly, it goes flying out the window. Nobody cares anymore. Everyone's running around trying to figure out what's happening, what's going on. Is it my fault? I hope it's not my fault. Let me make sure it's not my fault. So you lose a little bit about that, rah-rah team spirit kind of thing, because everyone wants to make sure they're not the one taking the fall for something. So when you think about that environment, that fog of war, if you will, where it's just all a little fuzzy, what can you do ahead of time that will help you make good decisions in that space? What will help you make objective decisions that are good for your company based on the plan that you've built, and not decisions that are based on emotions and fear and uncertainty? Because that's what's going to drive the train if you haven't already done this. If you haven't already built these tools and these reference points to say, here are the things that I need, who do I need to talk to? Let me look at, and I'll talk about a couple of the tools here in a minute. Who do I need to talk to? What do we need to do? What do we need to monitor? Let me get those things done ahead of time so that I can pull them off the shelf, look at them, and start moving down that road. As opposed to, let me think, what sounds important? I don't know. Who's in that job? Is there somebody? Is this relevant to, this business unit? You've already made those decisions. So you know and you can compare, and it becomes a much more objective exercise. That's when you make good decisions and not scary subjective decisions. So anything that'll help you save time. Think about the kinds of decisions you're going to have to make in that moment. What do we know? So ahead of time, roles and responsibilities, whose job is it to figure out what you really know? Who do we need to tell? So ahead of time, what can you build that will help you identify the full universe of people that you may potentially have to talk to, and identify the types of information they will need and the times you will have to talk to them? That's a stakeholder analysis. Quite possibly not in your world. If it is in your world, I'm kind of sorry for your job description. But somebody in your company should have been doing this. They should have a stakeholder analysis from any other type of communications planning that they've done, but making sure it's tailored to an actual cyber event is key. So a stakeholder analysis is everybody inside your company, not to the individual, but to the function that you will need to tell. And everybody outside of your company who has a stake in what happens to you. Investors, the board, the media, business partners, vendors, all of these people have to be included. Internally, executives. Well, are they, do you get subgroups within this? Do you have executives who are responsible for different regions of the world? They're going to need different information than someone else. Do you have a sales team? Do you have a customer service center? Is there somewhere where everyone's going to start calling when they figured out something happens? Someone's got to think about what those people are going to say when they answer the phone. They're the pointy end of the spear. You got to make sure they're set up for success and to protect you. So that big stakeholder analysis becomes essentially a big grid and a reference point. You pull it off the shelf, you know the facts that you have of the situation at hand, and you say, okay, based on what we know, here's what we need to talk, here's who we need to talk to, and based on the information we've gathered, here's the best way to talk to them. Here are the channels that exist for communicating with these groups, and here's who's responsible for it. You've already made those decisions because you've already put in the time. That will save you the time and help you make those decisions and not forget anybody who needs this information. Another important tool goes back to the molehills and mountains conversation. You need to have a scale, an impact scale that is appropriate for your organization. There's no one size fits all because something that impacts you may not impact someone else in the same way. But you need to have that built out, say 1 through 5. What counts as a 1? What counts as a 2, 3, 4, 5? Specifically based on the impact to your organization, and at each of those points, how are you supposed to respond? Who needs to be part of the conversation at each of those increasing levels of importance? Once you have that, you can say, again, what do I know? What do I know now? What is the potential for what this could become? But what is it actually right now? Not guessing, not speculating. And based on that, where does it fall on this scale? That's going to determine how you respond. Doing that ahead of time makes this a decision-making exercise, not an information-gathering exercise. It makes objective decisions better. So your team, your tools, and your to-do list. This is the what needs to get done. This is where you line up all those things that you have to do. Somebody has to monitor the media so that you have a heads up if there's any kind of leak coming in. Someone has to be on social media. Someone has to be gathering information. Someone has to be starting to draft responses. Someone has to put together a holding statement, which, again, in communication circles, quite often people still don't understand what a holding statement is. It sounds silly, but it will, save your ass more often than not. It is literally 3 or 4 sentences that say nothing. Literally nothing, because you probably don't know anything. All you do is acknowledge there's a thing and you're working on it and we got this, we'll get back to you with more information. Everybody knows at least one person who can talk for 20 minutes without saying anything. Probably more than one person. There's probably some in this room, all your heads just turned. So that is a holding statement. It is literally nothing, but in enough words to where if something gets out before you're ready to talk about it, you have an answer. You put out words that make people respond to you rather than you having to respond to other people. From a reputational communications perspective, it lets you continue driving the train even if you don't know where you're going. It keeps you in control of the situation. So that's on your to-do list. This is a checklist. This is so you say, okay, what do we have to do? And again, it makes objective decisions faster. You look at, is there anybody do we have any folks speaking at a conference this weekend? Do we have anybody doing a webinar on security this afternoon? All those kinds of things that you might want to pull back on. You might want to see what's in the pipeline, see if you need to adjust based to your situation. Is somebody sitting down for an interview with Forbes and we need to maybe adjust some of their talking points? Things like that that will help you, again, make good decisions, keep everything under control, and not just make it worse by losing control of the edges. So your team, your tools, and your to-do list. Majority of this can be done ahead of time. I always say that about 80% of what you need to communicate effectively in the event of an incident can be done ahead of time. And if you've done it ahead of time, then you are actually going to be better when you have to pull that trigger and actually implement that plan. Otherwise, all bets are off. Good luck. And training. This is also very important. I love sports metaphors. I hope that works here. Usually about half the audience is like, oh, okay, and the other half is like, oh God, sports metaphors. So bear with me. Nobody shows up cold on game day. You take a football team. You don't all say, great, welcome to the team. Here's your playbook. See you Sunday. And then you all show up and start introducing yourselves to each other right before kickoff. That's not how that works. You practice, practice, because you have to know what everyone else on that team is doing. You have to know what they're thinking, what their priorities are, where they're going, so that you can actually connect and make that work. You know, your quarterback needs to know not only what he or she is doing, they have to know what the wide receiver is doing so that they can actually connect. And it has to be predictable. There's muscle memory involved in training. The way that you develop good muscle memory is that you train in different ways. Every time there's a training, it doesn't have to be this giant shut down the company for a day, realistic, role-playing thing. It doesn't always have to be like that. That is important. That is a very important event. But you don't have to do that so often that it becomes a bother. Sometimes it helps to just sit down and say, all right, here's the script. Here's how this is going to go. Does everyone know what their role is? Okay, great. Check. See you in a quarter. Then you know who the people are, what they're doing. Everyone's made sure their, contact information is up to date. You can run anything in between that. Big, medium, small, whatever your objectives are, you can change how you train. But it's important to use realistic scenarios. Every training shouldn't be a bunch of executives sitting around a conference table reading from a script, because no one's getting anything out of that all the time. It's an important add to have injections. A little inject into the middle of your scenario. I do training workshops on this for different folks, and this is always one of my favorite pieces, because you really just get to screw with people's heads. And that's kind of the whole point of training, is to see where your plan is weak and to see where your people are where they're not expecting something to change, because they have to be ready to roll with that. So in the middle of an exercise, everything's going along. All of a sudden you pop in and you say, hey, I just saw this tweet from Brian Krebs. He mentioned our company. He doesn't know what's going on, but he heard there's a thing. And then you just step back and watch, because it's awesome. I mean, it's awesome if you think that's funny. I think it's funny. So that's a good way to test your plan and see if people are ready to think on their feet, because this isn't science. We're doing our best to make it as scientific and as methodical and as formulaic as possible. But at the end of the day, it's art. It's just art, because you have to feel your way through it to do it right. And it's going to change all the time, and you have to be ready for that. Understanding all the roles. We talked about this. This is important. This is where everyone on your team needs to understand what everyone else on your team is doing, so that they can more effectively handle their responsibilities in this unknown situation. When everything is in flux, you have to know where everyone else is moving around you so that you can make the best decisions possible within that context. So can you tell I'm visual? Like, I've drawn this whole thing up here. I hope you can see it. It's in the air. But everyone's got their own little place where they're spinning and doing the things they're responsible for, and they know what they are because you've built them ahead of time. You've told them what they are, and everyone knows what everyone else is doing, even if they're not watching it, because you've trained to it, and you understand how you're all working together. That's important. Don't underestimate the power of social media. Most people don't, but you'd be surprised at, as you go farther and farther up the food chain in a company, how often people really like to underestimate the power of social media. Hopefully there will come a point 20, 30 years from now where that's not the case anymore. God willing, it's sooner. But right now, people still underestimate social media. The things in the traditional crisis communications world where you used to say, it's a 24-hour news cycle, you gotta get stuff out there. Now it's about a 60-second news cycle. Things fly. That's why that holding statement is so important, because the minute something gets out there, it's like throwing it into a system and watching it just get swooshed away out of your hands. You lose control over it. So you need to know when something's coming at you, and you need to be ready to push something back at it quickly so you feed that constant machine, or it's going to feed on you. All the rumors are going to get out there before you have a chance to put out facts. All the people who are speculating about, oh my God, what you did, what you didn't, I heard this, I heard that, is going to get out there. And one of the easiest ways for something to leak is a completely innocuous social media post. Some of my favorites are, oh, hey, that's really funny. My buddy John came here, showed up on Tuesday. We weren't supposed to have lunch until Wednesday. That's funny. Yeah, well, John works for the forensics company. He's there checking out your system to see what just happened to it. And everyone knows where John works, so now they all know that you have an incident. It doesn't take a lot of dot connecting from someone who knows what the dots are to be able to put those kinds of pieces together and to then ask. So it'll all come together as a tweet, a question, a phone call from somebody who's like, hey, this looks funny. Is there a thing here? And it turns out there is a thing there, but you weren't ready to talk about it. So you have to be ready for that kind of thing. Like, hey, Mom, I'm not going to be able to make it home for dinner on Sunday night because I have to work all weekend, Mom posts on Facebook, oh, that's too bad. Johnny can't come home for dinner on Sunday. He has to work all weekend. Something big's going on at work. You know, that's really cute, except mom's probably not just talking to a bunch of other like 80-year-old moms. So, or however old all your moms are, which unfortunately may be my age, which is not 80. So you have to think about all those kinds of pieces. And again, those may not be your exact responsibilities, but you need to understand that those are considerations that somebody has to be thinking about. And if they're not, again, it has the potential to blow back on you, not them. So we train and we train and we train. And when we respond, we make sure that we've taken this great plan, that we've trained to it so well, and that we are actually executing that plan in an effective way. It's really hard to tell without being a fly on the wall what has driven decisions from some of these companies that communicated so badly. You don't know. Did you get bad advice? Did you have a bad plan? Or did you just choose to ignore all of it? And you know, somewhere there was a CEO who was like, oh, I'm just gonna fly by the seat of my pants. I have good instincts for this. Well, you don't always. So that's why you have a plan in the first place. There are important rules of thumb when it comes to response. Every response is gonna be different, and I can't stand up here and tell you these are the 5 things that you have to have in every single response, because it will change. It depends on the audiences, on the specifics of the incident, and it depends on who your company is and what you are trying to protect ultimately. The most important thing to remember, your objective, again, from the broader business perspective, relationship management matters. This is again, this isn't the forensics, this isn't the how do we, mitigate this threat, how do we get our networks clean? That's all going on anyway. The other piece that somebody else should be worrying about is managing your relationships through this event. That has to stay front of mind as this is happening. And based on that, you respond to incident specifics. You only talk about what you know. You don't guess. Guessing is where you have a problem, and this is particularly relevant to, I think, most of the people in this room, whether you are part of the response team or not. There's often, especially these days, a lot of pressure to have answers, and you're not always gonna have the answers, especially not in the beginning, and most of the timelines for notification are gonna hit before you know anything, or before you know everything, especially before you know everything. You may not even know anything, you just know, like, shit went down, and that's it, that's all I got. But it's important that wherever you fall in that food chain, wherever you sit in this ecosystem, when you own the information that someone else needs, that you are honest about what you know and that you don't guess. Some of the biggest problems you see are when companies and organizations put out statements saying, this is what happened, and they're wrong. They come back a week or two later and they say, just kidding, it's bigger than that. Oh, just kidding, it's big. Oh, wait, now it includes all this other information. Sorry, we didn't know anything, it turns out. But they guessed, and you don't know if that's because somebody who knew they didn't know anything felt pressured to say, oh, definitively, this is the answer, this is what we know, and then that worked its way up to that statement that went out, or if somebody felt obligated to present information in a more definitive way. You don't know, again, unless you're inside a company, but make sure that wherever you are in that chain, you are passing along accurate information. You're not guessing, you are not speculating. This is one of the biggest problems that causes legal liability, that causes extended news stories. One headline turns into 10, 15, 20, because you're guessing. That's really important. Audiences. This is part of what we talked about in building those tools. In that stakeholder analysis, you're gonna have audiences that you have to talk to. There's gonna be compliance requirements. There's gonna be notification requirements that you are bound to, 72-hour notifications from pick your new regulation du jour. GDPR says this, California's new law says this, New York's DFS regulation says this. Like, there's this enormous patchwork quilt that just sucks to try and dig through, and that's why you have really good lawyers. They will tell you who you have to talk to. Based on all of your vendor contracts, who do you have to talk to? Some of them you'll have to talk to in 72 hours. Some of them you won't. But some of them you will for certain situations, but not for others. So someone has to help you navigate that legal requirement. Everyone else is a gray area. Everyone else is a, who should I tell? Not who do I have to tell, but who should I tell? Who is going to be so much happier in this situation if they hear it from me directly? not if they read about it somewhere else or if they hear a rumor from someone else. That's a gray area, and that's part of what you try and sort through in that analysis piece ahead of time, so that you know, here are all of my gray area people and organizations, stakeholders, who do I have to talk to based on the facts of the situation? And that helps you navigate that situation. Drafting, messaging, and delivering appropriately. This is the what do you say. Your lawyer will tell you who you have to talk to and what you technically have to tell them. My job is to tell you how to say it so that that person actually takes the information and appreciates the information. I mean, nobody appreciates this kind of information, but you can say something like a lawyer to me, and I'm gonna wanna like punch you in the face for saying it. Or you can say something like a functional human being, and I'll be like, oh, that sucks. Okay, keep me posted. There's a big difference in that reaction. And that plays out in the broader company space too, with whoever you're talking to, whether you're telling companies or board members or investors or partners, whoever that is. Telling people like a human makes a really big difference and goes a long way towards not just generally making everyone mad at you, because angry people like to sue you, and that makes this whole thing blow out of proportion. Is anyone here a Legally Blonde fan by any chance? You know, angry people don't kill their husbands. It's kind of the same thing. Angry people don't sue you in large numbers. So we try really hard to manage those relationships and keep everyone from like hating you in mass. Expectations is a big piece here. I'm clearly pointing at this because I did learn that I should not walk over there and point at manage expectations. So I'm trying really hard to stay right here. Managing expectations is the key, and we've touched on it in basically every piece that we've talked about here. Managing expectations, because it's a cyber event, means that you're making sure from the very first time you open your mouth or you write a letter or you talk or notify anyone that you are managing their expectations to the fact that this isn't the end. This is just the beginning, but you've got it. It's under control, you have the right people, and you're doing the right things to figure out what happened, to fix it, and to make sure it doesn't happen again. But you're making sure that they understand there will be additional information that comes out over time, that this is not the final answer. And that's the big mistake that I was referencing before with companies. You know, you look at the big OPM breach from a few years ago. No, it was just this many. And then a week later, they came out and said, well, maybe it was like 10 million. Then they came out later, maybe it was like 17 million. And then somebody testified in front of Congress and it was a different number. And then the final number was even bigger than that. Yeah, that person lost their job because they guessed too much. You want to make sure, again, in the beginning, that you are setting up that expectation so that when you have updated information, somebody says, thanks for the update, and not, why are you changing your story? It's a very nuanced distinction, but it means the world when it comes to managing your reputation and preserving trust. You want people to trust you and to trust that what you're saying is credible. And if the answer is, I don't know anything yet, you tell them that, they're gonna believe you because you don't know anything. You wanna make sure that you are executing this plan in a way that actually holds on to that piece. This is one of the biggest pieces that gets dropped if you're just relying on somebody else to do this who's using the wrong playbook. Your playbook in the cyberspace has to manage those expectations more carefully than just about any other time. So that's a big piece to hold on to. All right, we're gonna go through a couple of fun examples here, good, the bad, and the ugly, and I acknowledge this needs to be seriously updated because pretty much every time you blink, there's like 7 more things that could go up here. So some of these are gonna be a little old, but they will hold out for a reason on here. So the good, yay. Home Depot, not new anymore. Feels like it happened 100 years ago. It didn't. It was not 100 years ago. We're gonna start with that one because they came right on the heels of Target, which is sort of one of the first big, like, what is this data breach thing moments for the general public. Home Depot came right after them, so they had the benefit of not being first, which is nice. The best quote I heard at a New York conference recently was, the early bird gets the worm, but the second mouse gets the cheese. Home Depot was the second mouse. Target was the first mouse. So Home Depot came out and they didn't say, here's what happened. They didn't say, we have our hands wrapped around this, we know what happened, here's what it is, we're fixing it. They balanced right, accurate, correct information and saying something really fast. Again, it's that statement that says lots of things really fast, but it doesn't actually say anything wrong because it doesn't actually say anything. That's important. And they reached out to people quickly. They kept the information flowing. They kept everyone updated throughout the process, and they worked and made changes to start restoring trust quickly. That helped. There's still an example. We still talk about them. It was a thing that happened, but they're on the good end of that because they manage relationships well. In a different way, Maersk, the global shipping company, everywhere, touches everything, probably ships everything you've ever heard of or touched yourselves, all around the world, completely shut down by NotPetya, completely lost everything. Like, there's some great articles out there giving really interesting color that's just fascinating, assuming you weren't the one sitting in the middle of it, about how they handled it. From a communications perspective, from a reputation perspective, they were brilliant because they focused on their customers. They prioritized customer relationships and execution, if you will. They put out commander intent, so we call it. The executive said, here's how this is gonna go. We are delegating authority, because we can't tell you anything ourselves, because we're just on our asses right now. But they sent out authority to everyone at every port and every little endpoint that they worked with and said, figure it out. Don't care how, don't care what it costs, just do it. So you, good Lord, I don't know what this thing is. You had people at ports all around the world, points of entry all around the world, using sticky notes, using handwritten ledgers to try and figure out what was in trucks, what was going places, using social media to communicate. And they lost a ton of money, hundreds of millions of dollars. But the loyalty they gained from their customer base by handling it the way they did will pay off in spades. Those are going to be customers for life and life and life. It's that reputation piece, and thinking about that, the way they handled it is just, it's textbook of how you put the right priorities first. So they had their team figuring it all out, cleaning everything up, trying to get back online, and at the same time, you had people actually out there on the ground making things work anyway. It was amazing. So the bad. Yahoo. Make up your minds. What happened? How much happened? This is one where you clearly just kept changing the story. It just kept getting bigger and it kept getting worse, and there was no expectation that it was gonna get worse, because every time it was, nope, here's what happened. Nope, okay, no, for real, this is what, okay, sorry, wait, for real, this is really what happened. Nobody believes you then. They lost valuation when, their merger, when they were acquired, they did not balance anything about right and fast. They just shot out the door, guessed at numbers, they were wrong. They kept digging because it kept happening over and over and over again. Expectations were not managed at all that this might change. And one of my favorite ones, their response to what we're gonna do about this was, you guys should change your passwords. Thanks. It's like the cyber version of super victim blaming. Nobody likes that, especially not the victim, especially not when there's, a billion victims. Nobody likes that. That's a lot of angry people. So the DNC, this one's a little different. Clearly not jumping into the politics and the specifics of what came out or when. P.S. Go vote. But this was a personal email. How it happened, phishing link, you can train people as much as you want. They're still gonna click on shit. They're just going to. So all of their emails got out there. Super embarrassing. All kinds of strategy, all kinds of things being written down that should not be written down, conversations in systems. And it just kept coming. It didn't all come out at once. It just kept dripping. That drip effect is a huge problem in crisis communications, because it's what takes that one story and turns it into 50 and makes those 50 election altering. It just keeps happening. It's still embarrassing, regardless of how they handled it, regardless of what they did. Personally, it was embarrassing for individuals. Professionally, it was embarrassing for the organization. Again, it's not always the data that you think you should protect that is the most damaging. Have to protect it all. And the ugly. Obviously, Equifax, I feel like it would be malpractice if I didn't mention Equifax, but you start to feel bad after a while. You can only dance on someone's grave so many times. But they're just so textbook of everything that went wrong. They just didn't, they literally knew about it months before they told us. It's kind of a problem. Why did you wait that long? Oh, because you wanted to sell off all your stock? Cool. Yeah, that makes me really happy about it. They are a textbook example of how to mismanage the communications of a response so badly that literally everyone hates you. It's not really good for business. Clearly, they're still in business, they're still moving, but if you think about all the things that went wrong, like they set up a website and then it crashed, and what the hell? Set up a website, it crashed, it went wrong, they were telling people, here's a free service that you can use. Oh, by the way, we run that service. We're not gonna tell you that. I mean, it just kept going. None of their customer-facing response was good. In their initial statement that they put out, the very first thing, if you read that statement closely, was, oh, we're so sorry this happened to us. What? Nobody cares that this happened to you. Everyone cares that it happened to us. Never start by telling us how bad you feel for yourself. We don't care. We are the victims. You should be a partner in this victimization with us. You should not do something that makes us look at you as the bad guy. That is a problem. That is another one of those nuances when it comes to reputation. If you are handling something in a way that turns the whole narrative around and makes you the bad guy in the situation, you've clearly done something wrong, and that is a very tough ship to turn around. So I put Target on here. Target has done, I believe, an amazing job since this happened in 2013 of building out a secure, making themselves secure, if you will, making all of us secure. They've done tons of stuff, they've led lots of changes, all of that's great. But if you look at everything they did in that moment, it's everything that's wrong. They also were the victim of being the first mouse, which sucks, clearly, if you're the first mouse. Home Depot benefited from it. Again, like we said, they weren't the shock value that Target was. But I leave Target on the ugly slide, if you will, because we are still talking about them. They are still the thing we point to say textbook bad response. Maybe not now, maybe now they would handle it beautifully, but then they didn't. And they're still there, which again, if we're still talking about how bad you are at crisis response and it's been 5 years and everyone else has been worse since then, that sucks for you. So you get to be on the ugly slide. So 3 things you can do today. Because again, now you all understand why this is important. You all understand why reputation matters, even if it's not your responsibility. You understand why resilience is the thing that matters. Regardless of whether these are your responsibilities, and more likely than not, they aren't, which is fine. Even if you're in charge of incident response planning, you're part of that team, you're part of the incident response team, all of this isn't gonna be in your AOR, and that's fine. But you should start asking the right questions. Because you need to make sure that somebody in your organization is taking responsibility for this, knows they have responsibility for this, and is doing it the right way. And you have a sense of what the right way is, and so you need to start that conversation to help make sure they are part of your plan, that you have plans that work together. They may have a great crisis set of plans for all kinds of scenarios, but it may not be an effective cyber event that they've planned for. You need to help them understand that so that you can work together in that response. And it all starts with asking the right questions. Sometimes the first question is, so who's my point of contact over here? Who do I talk to over in the communication shop? And that's great. Review your plan. Whatever kind of IR plan you have or planning that you've done, check it. If you haven't done one, good Lord, go do it. Once you've done it, check it from this lens. Check it from a communications perspective. There are quick, easy assessments that can be done to just identify where you may have a blind spot, where you may not have identified a vulnerability and accounted for it. These are easy things to do, and they can save you a lot of time and a lot of, weeping and gnashing of teeth in the long run. And then shifting your mindset from secure to resilient, not just for your networks, but for your entire organization. You're not gonna be able to protect everyone all the time, so you wanna make sure that everyone sleeps well at night, knowing that whatever happens, you got it. You can handle it because your organization's ready. That's what makes you resilient. So I believe we have like 45 seconds for questions, if anybody has any. Whoa, okay, we'll start right there, because you've been a good participator, nodding your head lots and lots, so I'll call on you first. Yep. Well, one way, and I'm not sure it would have necessarily worked in the DNC case because there were such sensitive political considerations all around it, but in traditional crisis communications, you avoid the drip by pushing it all out there yourselves. You know what they have, so you can control its release just as much as they can. Maybe you didn't want to put it out there, but sure as heck gonna have less of an impact if you put it all out there at once. It's like the bad news dump on Fridays at 4:45. If you dump all the shit at one time, nobody's gonna be able to dig through every single little piece of it, and every little piece won't get its own news cycle. The adversary is making sure that every little piece gets its own news cycle. If you shove it all out there at once, you got 1 or 2 news cycles maybe to dig it through, but no one's gonna take the time to make each individual piece a pain point. So dumping the grub, basically. There were others. Yes, way back there. Are you the Ativo guy? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right? No, I think it goes back to being transparent, being completely as transparent as you're possibly capable of being. It's not a drip because that's the expectations management piece. A drip is what Yahoo did, where they changed their story as they had new information. That's the expectations piece where in the beginning you say, what we know now, we're still looking, we're still investigating. The forensics team is still on site, the FBI is still here, we've got the best and brightest on it. But we will have more information as we discover more. That's not a very artful way of saying it, but that's essentially what it is. That's how you manage the expectations for, we will have more information for you when we know it ourselves. The investigation is ongoing. You don't say, here's what happened, XYZ, done, thanks, bye, call me for questions. Yeah, it's exactly, because you only know, snapshot's another great way to describe it. You only know what you can see right there. You only know your slice of the world with the visibility that you have, and over time, your visibility will grow. So you set up the expectation that when I know more, you'll know more, and there's gonna be more. So everyone sit tight, and if it turns out there is no more, guess what, there was no more. Now you're already used to what I told you, so it's not that big of a deal. If there is more, you knew it was coming. So now you trust me as a source of credible information and not as a less than credible person who's changing their story over time. Does that make sense? It's that managing those expectations right there in the very beginning that is not part of a traditional crisis plan. You don't manage expectations for the next 6 months. You manage expectations for, I'll have the rest of it for you tomorrow. Stay tuned. So, difference. Anyone else? 2 minutes. Oh, that was more than 45 seconds. Bring on all your super long questions. Yes? Mm-hmm. But is there any correlations like their long-term stock value or company value? Because everyone you showed there, I still do business with Home Depot. Right. Just bought like 12 Christmas presents at Target. Yeah. Right. It is kind of almost becoming a fact of life, and I think that there's not a lot of long-term research that I'm familiar with that says, if you do it wrong here, 6 years from now, you're probably out of business. Like, that doesn't really exist, but you look at, part of it is because some of the longer-term costs play out in the legal system. They play out in lawsuits. They play out in judgments, whether it's class action or otherwise. I think I just saw a headline about, Yahoo paying somebody however many millions of dollars. And it's like, wait, we're still talking about that? So I'm not aware of specific numbers around how that impacts, but if you look at, there's usually articles that are written about drop in stock prices, and then the stock prices go back up and down. You never want articles written about your company and how your stock prices are like fluctuating wildly because you screwed something up. So as that specific sort of reputation management side goes, those are never good, but the specific actual business financial impact just varies wildly. If you're a small, mid-sized business, this has a much bigger impact. There's some stat that, 86% will actually face a significant loss of business. 50% will be out of business if something happens to them, because it's so much more trust-based and their financial fluctuation is so much tighter. So even more important if you're small. Yes? That has nothing to do with the cyber side of communications. That has to do with just general message control within your organization. You have, it's in your employee handbook, who gets to talk, who doesn't get to talk, what happens if you do talk out of turn. Somebody very may well have put that doctor up there to talk, or they're in violation of a company policy, and that's always something that you run the risk of, which is part of why you monitor everything that's coming at you, because you never know who's gonna leak out the sides. But that kind of a thing is just a fact of life when it comes to communications across an organization. It sucks. I was at a government organization where I was working. One of my colleagues had what he considered to be a very good relationship with all the media, even though he had nothing to do with communications. He would send them daily emails every morning, or he would see their stories at 5 in the morning before the rest of us did. And by the time I even got to work, he had already fired off angry emails correcting 10 of them. So we just came to a happy compromise where every time he sent one of those angry emails, he would just CC me. Then I at least knew what kind of shit I was gonna have to deal with that day. It's a fact of life. It ain't all sunshine and butterflies, let me tell you. But yeah, for that kind of a situation, especially in a crisis event, it's very important to have that streamlined team in place so you can try and control that out. Awareness internally makes a big difference. So I think we're good. I'm getting the hook. But thank you guys very much. Good luck, and be around if you have any more questions.